In the winter of 1959, during the Cold War, a trekking group from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, led by respective leader Igor Dyatlov, set out to hike the Ural Mountains of Russia, which were part of the Soviet Union at the time. Despite all their training and expertise, an incident would occur 6.2 miles south of the goal that would baffle the world forever after. While we do not have all the pieces of the puzzle, diaries and cameras found at the hikers' last campsite made it possible to track the group's route up to the day preceding the incident. On January 31st, the hikers arrived at the highland area and began to prepare for their climb. They stored surplus food and equipment for the trip back in a wooded valley and would move through the pass on the following day. The group had plans to go over the pass and make a camp on the opposite side the following night. However, worsening weather conditions caused them to lose their direction and travel west of their route. When the group realized where they were, the questionable decision was made to set up camp on the slope of the mountain, rather than go back down by a mile into the woods, which would have offered them more shelter. Yuri Yudin, a member of the group who would leave the expedition 3 days before this point, speculated that Dyatlov made the decision either because he didn't want to lose altitude that they had gained, or because he wanted to practice camping on the slope. Yuri Yudin had left the group on January 28th due to knee and joint pain. He would be the only hiker to return alive. Yuri Yudin was expecting a telegraph from the group on their return, no later than February 12th. This never happened, and by February 20th, the first rescue groups were sent out. On the 26th of February, a search party located the tent. What they found would perplex them. The tent contained no hikers, but all of their belongings and shoes and most of their clothes were left behind. Investigators discovered that the tent was cut open from the inside. What could have terrified these expert hikers so much to cause them to destroy their only shelter and leave so barely dressed for the negative 30-degree weather? Even more confounding, you'd think that in the face of such danger the footsteps leading the tent would be in a hurry. But the footprints of the 9 hikers, wearing only socks or one shoe or even barefoot, were consistent with a calm, single-file walking pace down to the woods. The discovery of the bodies would also create more questions than answers. The first 2 bodies were found next to a cedar tree in an old fire. Branches toward the bottom of the tree were broken off, likely from somebody trying to climb it. The pair were wearing just underwear. The first hiker, Yuri Doroshenko, suffered a large burn covering the right side of his head. He also had burn marks on his foot. Perhaps these were from getting too close to the fire in an effort to stay warm. He was covered in scrapes and bruises, and his ears, nose, and mouth were covered in blood. Doroshenko also had a gray fluid coming out of his mouth, a symptom consistent with a strong force to the chest. The gray fluid never made the original report, and the official cause of death was stated to be hypothermia. Next to Doroshenko lay Georgy Krivonoshenko. His body was covered with bruises and cuts too, and he had burns up his foot, legs, and on his hands. A chunk of his own knuckle was found in his mouth, suggesting that he was probably biting his knuckles to stay conscious as he froze to death. Both bodies appeared to have been moved after death. The official cause of death was stated to be hypothermia. The next 2 to be found were Dyatlov and Zinaida Kolmogorova, who appeared to be heading back toward camp. Dyatlov was found with his fists clenched, and like the other 2, his body appeared to have been moved after death. He had abrasions and bruises on his ankles and cuts and bruises on his face. Dyatlov was missing an incisor in the jaw. All of these injuries were consistent with a fist fight. The official cause of death was stated to be hypothermia. Kolmogorova was slightly better dressed and wearing a sweater with the right sleeve that was torn off. This may have been taken by the other hikers in a desperate effort to stay warm. Perhaps the first 2 hikers had also had clothing removed by the last to die, explaining their lack of clothing and post-mortem manipulation. However, this doesn't explain why so little clothing was put on by the group from the start, before they left the tent. Kolmogorova had also abrasions on both of her hands and bruises on her face. She had a long bruise on the side of her body, which investigators stated to be consistent with a hit from a baton. These injuries showed clear signs of struggle. The official cause of death was ruled to be hypothermia. The next body to be found was that of Rustin Slobodin. He had bleeding in both temples and a large crack in his skull. According to the medical investigators, he likely survived this injury for as long as an hour after it occurred, although he would have been extremely disoriented and dizzy. His body was also moved after death, and the official cause was stated to be hypothermia. Months would pass before a member of the Mansi tribe who inhabited the area would discover a den made by the last 4 hikers. Ludmila Dubinina's body was draped over a natural ledge with water flowing around her. She was missing tissue from the lips and mouth, so that her teeth were exposed. She was also missing soft tissue from her jaw and cheek, exposing these areas of her skull. She had an alarming 10 broken ribs and massive hemorrhaging in her heart. Her eyes and tongue were also missing, and blood in her stomach suggested that she may have been alive when these injuries occurred. Dubinina was the first death to be ruled as having a cause other than hypothermia, officially ruled as internal hemorrhaging to the right atrium of the heart as a result of severe chest trauma. Semyon Zolotaryov, known to his friends as Alexander, was better dressed, wearing 3 pairs of pants, a long jacket, a sweater, 2 hats, a scarf, and boots. Like Dubinina, Zolotaryov had also suffered catastrophic injury to the chest, resulting in 5 broken ribs and a flail chest. He also had tissue missing on his right eyebrow, exposing his skull, and a deep gash in the back of his head. His eye sockets, too, were empty. Zolotaryov and Dubinina suffered these extreme chest injuries while they were still alive. Medical experts would conclude that these injuries were caused by an extremely large force that could not have been caused by another human being. They also suffered internal injuries akin to a car crash, but had no bruising where the force would have hit. It remains unexplained how injuries like these were even possible. Zolotaryov's death was quickly ruled to be hypothermia, although it was later confirmed that he died from severe chest trauma. Alexander Kolovatov was slightly better dressed than most of his companions, although his clothing was still poor for the weather conditions. There were also rips and tears on his jacket and his pants. Burn marks were found on his socks and his jacket, and he was missing both his eyebrows, revealing bone in the area they once rested. His nose was broken, and his neck was snapped and deformed. He also had a large gash behind his right ear. These obvious signs of major struggle were present and were initially left out of the autopsy, which was vague and misleading. His official cause of death was stated to be, you guessed it, hypothermia. Like Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol was somewhat dressed for the elements, and thus the two may have already been outside at the time the tent was fled by the others. Thibault-Brignol had bruising on his lips and the lower side of his face, as well as internal bleeding in the right lower forearm. His skull was fractured, and there were cracks all over the left side of his skull. These injuries would also be ruled to be the result of an extremely powerful force, and like the other mysterious injuries exhibited, no damage to the soft tissue could be found on the areas above the fractured areas. Again, these injuries were ruled to be nothing a human could have done. This powerful, non-human force resulting in a skull injury was ruled to be the cause of Thibault-Brignol's death. To summarize, all 9 hikers had mysterious injuries, including bruising and cuts all over their bodies. Many of them had catastrophic injuries akin to having been hit by a car, and signs of struggle. But we're not quite done with listing the facts just yet, because another layer of mystery comes from the fact that radiation was found on all of the hikers' clothing, as well as in the entire area of Dyatlov Pass. Experts would conclude that there was no natural explanation for the amount of radiation found on the hikers. And of course, we are also still left with the question of why these hikers tore their only shelter open just to walk single file down the mountain. Many theories have been put forth to ease our minds, but so far not one of them is conclusive, despite various individuals and organizations claiming a particular theory to have solved the case. Before I present the various popular theories, which include ideas both rational sounding and a bit zany, I must admit that not one of them truly provides a solid answer for what happened in Dyatlov Pass between February 1st and 2nd of the year 59. Psychological theories have been posited that may help explain some aspects of this case, although they do fall short of providing a full explanation. For example, hypothermia can cause hallucinations, which may have caused them to flee the tent in terror, but I think it's unlikely that all the hikers would have suffered the same delusion to cause them to cut open their tent and march all the way down the mountain. Taking a look at other psychological forces, the fact that the hikers left behind most of their clothing and shoes could be explained somewhat by a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. This happens when people get so cold that it feels like their skin is burning, causing them to tear off their clothes and seek the cold. However, the idea that the hikers were suffering from this affliction is contradicted by the fact that some clothing was ripped from other hikers who died first and used to warm the others. There was also a fire made by the first hikers and a den made by the last, clearly showing that these men and women were doing their best to try and keep warm and were not experiencing any paradoxical undressing. Another phenomenon, a repeating pattern of swirling vortices called the Kármán vortex street, has also been suggested as a cause for the hikers' deaths. Wind going around the terrain could have resulted in an infrasound capable of producing panic attacks. This sound could have caused extreme duress, causing them to flee their tent and head for the trees. By the time they got down the mountain, the sound would have stopped and allowed the group to regain their composure, but by then it would have been too late. Unfortunately, none of these theories really go beyond offering possible explanations to the leaving of the tent and possible signs of struggle from a fight, from hallucinations, or something like that. They don't do anything to explain the strange injuries, radiation, or anything else about this case that makes it so puzzling. An early theory for the incident involves the Mansi people that lived in the area. As the hikers traveled onto the side of the mountain, known by the locals as Death Mountain, they could have been attacked. The idea that the Mansi people could have attacked them and even sacrificed the hikers was endorsed by the fact that a sacrificial chung, a symbolic structure signifying a sacrifice, was found a few hundred meters away from where the hikers were found. It was suggested by early investigators and speculators alike that the Mansi knew the area so well that they could have then covered their tracks. The hikers may have cut the tent open after sensing an impending attack and then been forced to watch single file down the mountain to their doom. Alright, if you were going to sacrifice 9 people, would you leave them all over the place? I wouldn't. I feel like a good sacrifice ends at the chung, but there's no human remains on the chung. There were antlers on the chung, however, so the structure was probably used to sacrifice a moose. And oh yeah, there's no evidence of the Mansi people ever having done human sacrifices. This theory also wouldn't explain the radiation or the injuries, which, again, medical examiners confirmed couldn't have been caused by a human. Overall, this theory used the Mansi people as an early scapegoat for the situation. The next theory we're going to discuss is one that seems the most rational: an avalanche. An avalanche would be a good reason to escape the tent quickly, even if it meant they had to cut it open. However, the area is not known for avalanches, with over 100 expeditions being held since the incident, and not one of them ever seeing any evidence of an avalanche having occurred. There was no physical trace of an avalanche, which would have likely been apparent for such a major event. An avalanche would leave certain patterns and debris distributed over a large, wide area. The bodies found had only a shallow layer of snow on them, but an avalanche significant enough to cause these bizarre injuries would have also swept the bodies away with it. Different, more serious injuries would have occurred, and the tree line would have been damaged. Geohazards expert Jim McElwain stated that for the avalanche to inflict such violent injuries, it would have had to been moving at a very significant speed and be incredibly stiff. The slope of the campsite was very shallow, under 30 degrees, and not likely to have resulted in an avalanche, especially one of this degree. Finally, the injuries suffered by the 9 were not consistent with those caused by avalanches. Typically, asphyxiation is a main cause of death for avalanche victims. If the avalanche had caused large rocks and trees to crush against the hikers, it would have caused major damage and there would have been soft tissue damage where the objects hit, rather than the strangely internalized injuries that were observed on the bodies that were found. Evidence of this debris would also have been visible to the searchers. So none of this explains why the hikers, after being hit by an avalanche, would run off into the snow without their clothes. These hikers were trained at the highest level, and something must have truly terrified them to leave their shelter and enter the negative 30-degree conditions unclothed. Neither does it explain the unnatural levels of radiation present. The next two theories are a little more out there. Because these theories propose things that the nature of which has yet to be confirmed, these theories should be taken with a grain of salt. But I decided to include them anyway because there's been so much talk about them that not to mention any of it would cause me to leave out what could be key points of evidence. There is a theory that a large creature could have attacked the hikers. This would explain why the tent was torn open in such a rush. It could also explain some of the unusual injuries suffered by the hikers that couldn't have been caused by a person. The animal would have to be extremely large and strong to have caused such horrific damage to the hikers. Believers of this theory point to this image taken by the hikers. People who believe that a creature attacked the hikers swear this photo appears to contain a Yeti, or essentially a cold weather Bigfoot. Personally, I think it looks like a man in snow gear, but that's up for you to decide. It also seems unlikely that whatever animal did this damage would have covered its tracks so that no evidence was left behind. Another theory that people have adopted is the idea that extraterrestrials may have been to blame. On the night of the incident, bright lights were seen in the night sky. A group of hikers about 31 miles south of the Dyatlov Pass reported seeing a strange orange sphere in the sky on the night of the incident. Various independent witnesses also observed these spears of light in the night sky around this period, although these statements were not kept in the initial report released to investigators. From the photos left behind by the hikers, we see that Dyatlov at least appears to have been photographing some sort of light form in the sky. However, these photographs may have been damaged by water, altering the image. Supporters of this theory hold that the radiation could have been explained by alien contact, and that the strange injuries found on the hikers could have been inflicted by such extraterrestrials. One final theory involves weapon testing. At the time of Dyatlov incident, the Soviet Union was in the grips of a Cold War. It is entirely possible that these hikers may have fallen victim to a military test by USSR forces. Some experts have posited that a test involving radiological weapons would explain the burn injuries, as well as the confounding level of radiation on the hikers' belongings. However, the burns would also have been from the hikers trying to light a fire to keep warm, so I'm not very convinced there. However, suspicions about a Soviet cover-up were bolstered by the fact that the Soviet government buried evidence regarding the incident for up to 3 years before inconsistencies were revealed to the public through reporting and autopsies. One member of the search party claimed that military boot footprints were found in the single-file trail of the hikers. It is also true that the Soviet Union at the time was testing new weapons in remote areas similar to the pass. The testing of bombs, mines, and rockets could cause the hikers to flee the tent. These weapons would also cause the injuries that they suffered. Parachute mines in particular, which explode in the air, are known to cause devastating internal injuries similar to those suffered by the hikers. However, this has the same pitfall as the avalanche theory, because no such debris was ever reported to be found in the vicinity. It has been confirmed that the rockets were shot in the direction of the pass from a military group at the time of the hiker's death, but officials state that the rockets would not have landed anywhere near the group. Each of these theories offers some explanation to what could have happened to the hikers. Some focus on explaining why the hikers fled their tent, while others are more concerned with the strange and devastating injuries they suffered. Hopefully, the mystery surrounding this tragedy will someday be solved, not just to satisfy our curiosity, but to provide peace to the families of these 9 young men and women who may never truly know what happened to them. So, tell me, what do you think? Why did they flee in such a rush, leaving their clothing and shelter behind? What could have caused these devastating injuries and the radiation found on their bodies? Could a large animal or other life we have yet to understand be to blame? Or is this a cover-up of weapons testing by Cold War Soviets? Perhaps this mystery will never truly be solved.